Hey, what's up, podcast people? So glad to have you back for another edition of Daily Scone. Before we get started, if I could just take like 20 seconds and beg you, plead with you to subscribe to this podcast and share it. If you know someone who aspires to be in sports media, maybe it's you yourself or is interested in this sort of thing, please share this podcast with them and go back and scroll through this feed, through the episodes that are posted, and see if there are episodes that might strike your interest. So it's all archived there. My goal with this is just for it to be a resource for people in or who aspire to be in sports media, and maybe it's good advice. So if you have questions, by all means, please ask. Please email me, mattmoscona@gmail.com. Comment on any of the, whatever platform you're listening to this. If it allows comments, I check all of them like all day. My notifications are set. So please leave comments, leave questions. If you have questions, that's been the basis of a lot of episodes that I've done. People who have asked questions and I've replied to them and made that an episode of the podcast. So my goal is to publish something here every day that I hope is helpful for you. And a lot of times, I know what's helpful for you based on what you want to know about. So fire away with questions if you have them. So today, something I wanted to do was actually point an example of persistence and how persistence can pay off in media and just following advice. So I went back and looked in the email. Back in February the 20th, I got an email from a guy named Charles Rees. And R-E-E-S. And it turns out Charles hosts a podcast, Bros Who Think. The show is Prime Time, is what he sent me a few links of his podcast. And he said, "Hey man, I do a podcast." He's based out of Lafayette. So I do a sports podcast. I'd love to have you on as a guest. And do you ever have any advice for me? So I wrote him back, happy to come on, of course, as I tell you all the time. If you ever invite me to be on a podcast or a show or anything, I'll say yes 100% of the time. It's a matter of working out a time to get it done, but I will say yes 100% of the time. So that was back in February. I replied. We tried to make it work then. Timing, for whatever reason, it didn't. Well, I went on my life and forgot about it, and I don't know what made him circle back, but persistence, it's such an important thing. Like, anytime someone asks me, like, "Hey, can I come intern for you," or anything like that. Well, we have, an intern program at our radio station. I say, look, here's our program director's contact. Send him your resume, your tape, contact him. And a lot of times people will do it, but then they'll never follow up. And something I tell people all the time is be persistent and bother people. I'm not saying, be a nuisance. I'm not saying make people want to put out a restraining order, but I'm saying follow up and make people remember that you are there, because people have busy lives. I mean, everybody has jobs and families and things going on. So don't be afraid to remind people that you're there. People are generally well-intentioned. It just, they get busy, and you have to make yourself a priority. So anyway, Charles Rees wrote me back a few weeks ago, circled back about coming on the podcast again, was happy to do it. We booked a time. Well, the time we booked was this past Friday, and it just so happened we were going to do it at noon, and it just so happened I ended up in a client meeting that ran very long, and by the time I got out of the meeting, it was 12:45. So I immediately emailed him like, "Man, I'm so sorry." He was very understanding, and we rescheduled for today, and we did the podcast today. But something he said to me, he's like, "Man, I apologized again profusely." And he's like, "Oh man, look, we're small time. No biggie, don't worry. Just glad we get it done." Hey, and I said to him, I was like, look, man, I don't care how big or small that you think you are. If someone commits to spending time with you, if they book a time, then hold them to that. And the other thing is, man, don't ever pass yourself off as thinking, "Well, I'm small time." It doesn't, everybody's time matters. It doesn't matter if you have 1 million listeners to your podcast or 10 listeners to your podcast. If someone's going to commit time, value their time, but also understand that your time is valuable as well. So anyway, I felt legitimately badly that it happened, but it was a circumstance that was out of my control. But I do appreciate him being understanding. So anyway, we did the interview on the podcast. I'll retweet the link when it's published. I'm happy to do that. and share it on social media and all that stuff. So hopefully you'll go listen to it. And I want to give him a compliment because he did a couple of things in the interview that I'd hope that you go listen to and that you take to heart, because they're things that I recommend to anybody. Like I did a podcast a while back. It was called The Art of the Interview. And it was a lot of different pieces of advice that I gave on how to conduct a successful interview. And some of the things that I mentioned in there, he very clearly did. I'll give you a few, for instance. He mentioned, of course, knowing that my son was in the hospital in Houston. Well, he tied that to a kicker question. Something I talk about all the time is, man, do your research. Like, do your research on the subject that you're interviewing so you go into that interview prepared. The more research you do and the more prepared you are for the interview, the more likely you are, the guest will notice, and the more likely you are to get really thoughtful answers out of that person in a fun interview as opposed to common stock answers to questions. So anyway, he brought up Torchy's Tacos, which is like a very popular taco joint in Houston. He asked me what my favorite Torchy's taco was. So it caught me off guard. Like, made me sit there and think. I was like, you know what, man? I love the Trailer Park. And they have another one called the Democrat, and you can make it trashy where they like adds cheese and stuff to it. I was like, man, it's fantastic. But anyway, it was like a very, that's not something that generally is just going to pop into your head. He also knew that I was from New Orleans and asked me some question about, like, you know, my favorite snowball in New Orleans. Apparently everybody in New Orleans likes snow, which I actually didn't know that was a thing, a legit thing, that like everyone in New Orleans loved snowballs and all these different kinds of snowballs. But it was a good question, and it showed that he had prepped for the interview, that he took advice and worked in kicker questions to make the interview a little more lighthearted and sort of to get me off guard. And it was great. It worked very well. It disarms a guest, and it's important to do those types of things. So, look, a couple of lessons that I think are super important. Number one, the power of the ask. You know, like, you'll never get an interview if you don't ask. So if there's someone you want to talk to on your podcast or on your YouTube show, whatever, ask. Reach out to that person. Ask that person. And by the way, if you're and you're listening to this, you're someone who's being solicited for an interview, say yes. You're not too big to say yes to anybody. That ticks me off when people say no to me. It's like, it doesn't, like, nobody should big time anybody. It's crap. It's annoying is what it is. Like, nobody's too big to do an interview for someone because they're too small. It's like, that's whenever you forget how you got where you are. And everybody can improve, and everybody can be better, and everybody can pay things forward, and everybody can help people that are aspiring to do better. So say yes. Anyway, sorry, I'll get off my little soapbox with that. So, the power of the ask. Prepare for your interviews as well, and be persistent, man. If someone tells you no the first time or says, hey, get back with me later, make a note, set it in your calendar 3, 5, 7 days, whatever it is later, and go back to that person and ask again. And if it doesn't work, set another reminder. 3, 5, 7 days. Go back again. Don't let them forget you. Be persistent. That's important in anything. In asking for interviews and booking guests and trying to get jobs. Like, make sure people remember you. So be persistent. That's a great lesson that Charles learned today. And you know what? It paid off for him. He wanted me to be on his podcast. And he first emailed me back in February. So March, April, May, June, 4 months. It took 4 months to schedule it and execute it, but it worked because that guy was persistent. And now here I am talking about it again and telling you should go listen to that guy's podcast, Charles Rees, Rees. Go follow him on Twitter and look up his podcast and check it out and give it a listen. So anyway, tip of the cap to Charles. And look, if you got something, I say this all the time and I mean it sincerely. If you want me to listen to something, send it to me. Or if you don't like the way I do what I do, no problem. Find someone that you do respect and someone that you do like the way that they go about their business, the way they present themselves in media, and send them a link and ask them to give it a listen. And if they say no, well, crap on them. Go to the next one. Anyway. All right, that'll do it for another edition of Daily Scone. I appreciate you for listening. Hey, if you've got questions, please send them. It's a great way for me to organize topics on the podcast. And please, please, please rate this podcast. Hopefully you rate it well. And subscribe on whatever platform you're consuming this right now. Hit the subscribe button And if you know someone in media or who aspires to be in media, please share this. That's how we'll grow it. So in the meantime, until next time, this is Daily Scone.